today's public hearing to examine the link between missing children and human trafficking. You know, we always saw those milk cartons with children pictures on those milk cartons and saying, do you know where these children are? I mean, just thousands, tens of thousands. And I've asked law enforcement and other informed people, and I said, where are these kids? Where are they? What happened to them? And they don't know. We're going to try to find out. Today is the first step in trying to find out just exactly what happened to these children. We suspect we know what happened to them. They've been exploited and brought into human trafficking. As many know, the crime of human trafficking is common in Pennsylvania throughout the nation. Don't think it's not in Pennsylvania. Everybody thinks it's in a third world country or something. It's in Pennsylvania. They're predators that are roaming the shopping centers of our state, looking for children, vulnerable children. They have a knack for that. They're violent, sexual, compulsive predators, child sexual predators. And this is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world. While recently enacted legislation has begun to empower law enforcement to more effectively prosecute human trafficking and better direct victims to appropriate services, we are continuing to closely examine this issue and the far-reaching aspects on a wide variety of victims. While today there are hundreds and thousands of missing children in the United States, the last comprehensive study in 1999 found that there were over 800,000 missing children. Regardless of how children become missing, we do know that they are highly vulnerable to becoming victims of human trafficking. A study in Chicago found that 56% of the prostituted women were initially runaway youth, and similar numbers have been identified for the male population. The purpose of today's hearing is to bring this issue to the public and hear from experts that can shed light on this troubling matter. I thank today the witnesses for preparing their testimony and offering their guidance to this committee in regard to this very important issue of what's happening to missing children in our country. I also like to thank Senator Leach, who's to my right, the minority chair of the committee, who's very, very active in this issue as well, and goes all over the county and the state talking about it. He's a real advocate, and we need advocates like him to continue to push on in this area. We also have Senator Yoel, Eichelberger, Vlakovich with us as well. Senator, would you like to?
Only to say thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this issue. Senator Greenleaf and I have been working very hard, particularly in the human trafficking aspect of this and how to deal with this pervasive and heinous crime and tragic situation. And we're just grateful for the opportunity to learn more that might give us some more ammunition to fight the scourge of human trafficking and to, in general, try to protect the children of our state. Government has no more central function than to do that. And so we're grateful to the testifiers today and look forward to hearing what they have to say.
Okay, the next, the witness, the first witness is Melissa Snow, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Ladies, thank you for being here. We appreciate your coming here and presenting testimony and your interest in this this subject.
Good morning.
Morning.
Greenleaf, Minority Chair Leach, and members of the committee, it's really an honor to be here with you this morning to discuss the issue of child sex trafficking and how it intersects with missing and runaway children in our country. My name is Melissa Snow, and I'm the Child Sex Trafficking Program Specialist at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And I've worked on the issue of child sex trafficking for a little over 13 years. And over those past 13 years, I've really watched our nation shift the way we view young people that are exploited through child sex trafficking, to see them as victims and survivors, to really figure out ways that we can break down silos and connect systems to weave a better safety net to protect young people from being targeted and recruited by traffickers. Prior to joining the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I ran a direct service program that worked directly with survivors of sex trafficking. That program was in Maryland, and as you might imagine, we had many situations of young people from Pennsylvania that were trafficked into Maryland, and I had a lot of survivors from Maryland that were trafficked into Pennsylvania. And so I have quite a few direct service stories of how those systems connected in fantastic ways that provided safety nets and services for children. And I also have a lot of firsthand experience about how we can strengthen those systems to better provide additional protection. As you all are aware, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was founded in 1984, and we're congressionally authorized to provide 22 functions that create services for missing and exploited children. And you all have received my written testimony. So rather than going step by step through that testimony, I'd like to focus my verbal comments today really specifically on what we're seeing across the nation that's really working when we talk about the intersection of missing and runaway children and child sex trafficking, and really what communities should look at as they are really trying to address a comprehensive strategy to keep young people safer from this form of exploitation. Child sex trafficking is a priority issue at the National Center because these kids are actively missing and currently being exploited. The reality is, as the Senator mentioned in his opening remarks, that these children are right here in our own communities. These are kids that are having contact with the system every day. I think we'd like to imagine that these kids are kind of hidden away somewhere and it's hard to find them. But the reality is they are coming into contact with social service systems, child welfare, law enforcement, members of the medical profession, clinics, ERs, homeless and runaway youth street outreach programs every day. So they're not exactly hidden, but they're invisible to our systems because people don't have the proper training to know how to identify, what questions to ask, and when they're found, how to properly respond to this population. I know when we looked at our own systems at the National Center, we realized that there was a silo. There were some silos going on. We had our Missing Children's Division that was actively providing assistance to law enforcement, guardians, family members on missing child cases that have been reported in. And we're of course identifying some of those missing kids as being exploited through child sex trafficking. Then an entirely other division at the National Center, we had our Exploited Child Division, which runs our cyber tip line. Cyber tip line receives reports from members of the public, law enforcement, and electronic service providers on online exploitation that's happening to children. And we knew that there was online exploitation specifically with online classified ads where kids were being reported in through the cyber tip line. But we had two separate divisions that were working on this issue. And we realized that by forming our child sex trafficking team, we were able to connect these two areas. And what we found was very shocking. The missing kids that we were looking for, we found, and they were being advertised and sold online for sex. And had we not connected these two divisions, we wouldn't have been able to give a face and a name to these kids that were actively being advertised online, then providing that information to law enforcement so that they could go out and recover these young people. The really important thing about connecting the dots on these two systems was that, for example, let's say Destiny, who was reported missing in Clearwater, Florida, she was being advertised in Toledo, Ohio. And so had we not connected these two systems, law enforcement that would be looking for her in Florida, in Clearwater, Florida, would have never found her there because she wasn't there. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack and looking in the entirely the wrong haystack. So by connecting systems, we're able to share information and make sure that these young people are found as quickly as possible when they're actively missing. And when we have indicators or information about that online exploitation, we can get it to law enforcement who can respond because they're in the jurisdiction where they may be found. In order to really comprehensively address trafficking, and after you've seen the psychological, the emotional, the physical, the spiritual impact this has on a young person, even when they've only been in it a short period of time, let's just say 24 hours, you're very compelled to talk about prevention, right? I've seen thousands, I've worked with thousands of young people and young women that have been exploited in this way, and their lives are forever changed. And so I'm a huge advocate for prevention efforts because if we can prevent this from happening in the first place, and we can prevent this from happening in the first place, then we truly have done a better job. And when we talk about prevention efforts, prevention for child sex trafficking is all about focusing on homeless, runaway, and our child abuse systems. We really need to focus on how these young people are being targeted by traffickers and the vulnerabilities they have and the things that they need that are making them vulnerable for being targeted. So when we talk about where those resources should go and where prevention efforts can be focused, it's all about investing in programs like Covenant House, who you're going to hear from later on today, because they really sit at the fork of providing additional resources and support for young people when they are in a very tough situation of having to make that decision on whether to be able to access some support or whether they have to rely on individuals who may not have the best intentions in mind for them. Data on the issue of the intersection between missing, runaway, and child sex trafficking is really tough. And the numbers are very scattered in the field. So at the National Center, we decided to look at our own data to see if we could draw any connection. And what we found is that in 2014, 1 out of every 6 endangered runaways reported to us was likely a victim of child sex trafficking. 1 out of every 6. And that is a very conservative estimate. We wanted to make sure that we had strong data to stand behind, and so we set the bar very high. And when I mention the term endangered runaways, we call every single runaway that's reported into us an endangered runaway, because we believe that immediately when they're leaving, when they have left their home for whatever reason, that they are automatically in danger for a variety of different things, including child sex trafficking. Technology, as I'm sure you've heard in previous hearings about child sex trafficking, has entirely changed the landscape on how not only young people are being targeted and recruited, but also are being advertised for sale. And when we talk about prevention especially, we really have to focus on providing all young people child sex trafficking awareness training, but especially those young people who we know are at the greatest risk. While I was a direct service provider, I was leading a group with a group of survivors, a group of young people. And we were going through the risk factors that make a young person vulnerable. We were talking about a kid being missing from care, involved with the foster care system. We were talking about how young people who have experienced previous sexual abuse are at greater risk. And I could see that there was this one young lady in the group that was getting visibly agitated. So I asked her what was she thinking, what was going on. And she said to me, I was all of those things. I was a kid that had previous sexual abuse. I was a kid that was in foster care. I was a kid who was chronically running away and being moved from placement to placement. And nobody ever talked to me about trafficking. And she said, you know, the first time I heard the word pimp was the only time I'd heard the word pimp before I met my pimp was in hip hop music or a rap song, right? If we are not providing young people with information and education to give them the tools to protect themselves when these situations come at them, then we are woefully letting them down in providing them with resources and tools. At the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we've really focused our efforts on prevention. We have an entire division that runs a Net Smarts program that really talks about online safety as well as prevention towards all different types of abuse and exploitation that is coming at young people. As I mentioned previously, for our data, we found that 1 out of every 6 endangered runaways reported to us, because we certainly don't get all reports of missing children, only the reports that are provided to us through law enforcement, a parent, or legal guardian. But 1 out of every 6 was likely a victim of child sex trafficking. And as we dug a little deeper into that number, we found that 68% were in the care of social services or foster care when they went missing. That's a huge percentage that have been re-victimized through that exploitation. On September 29th in 2014, President Obama signed the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. And this is a huge step forward in recognizing that child welfare has a role to play in identification as well as response to child sex trafficking. There is one section, Section 104, in that particular law that references the National Center that we are very excited about. It is an entire game changer in the way that we do business and the way that we operate as it comes to child sex trafficking and missing children. And what Section 104 does is it directs child welfare agencies, state child welfare agencies, to first report children missing from care to law enforcement, and most already do that. They report them missing to their local law enforcement. But the next step requires them to also report that child missing to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So we are really excited about this law. It's going to be a huge amount of workload for us and a different way of operating, but we really feel like that allows us to provide a safety net for kids that we already know are at an increased vulnerability. We've been in touch with the Pennsylvania Office for Children, Youth, and Families to provide technical assistance in how they can connect with our systems, access resources, and come into compliance with this law, which is required by September of 2016. And we really encourage ongoing discussions on how we can strengthen that process so that we can make sure that no child who is missing from care falls through the cracks. One of the other pieces that's important when we talk about that continuum of services is that once a child goes missing and law enforcement is searching for that child, we have to make sure that those who are searching for them have been trained on how to identify and respond to child sex trafficking. Child sex trafficking recovery is very chaotic. I've been a part of a lot of law enforcement operations where kids are recovered in hotels or on streets, and it is very complicated. The amount of trauma that that young person has gone through bonds them to their abuser. And victims are not quick to self-identify or really embrace the services that are being received. And so law enforcement have to know what they're up against in these types of recoveries. They have to know how to treat kids, and they have to know that building out that multidisciplinary team in advance of that recovery is going to help that kid get the resources that they need when they are recovered, and also really help law enforcement build the rapport and the relationship necessary to make sure that their ongoing investigations are successful. So to that end, at the National Center, we have created the Child Sex Trafficking Awareness and Response Training. It's a 3.5-day training that equips law enforcement with those in-depth investigative skills, as well as the process of how to build out that comprehensive team to make them the most successful. I also want to mention and applaud your efforts with Senate Bill 851, more commonly referred to as the Safe Harbor legislation. This is a really important piece of legislation that addresses, as you all well know, really focusing on a child protective response for young people, diverting them out of the criminal justice system, not holding them accountable for the crime that's been committed against them, and really allowing for the creation of these specialized resources. I cannot stress how important those specialized resources are, and how important it is that we invest the amount of resources necessary to create those different types of programs. As we know, a single act of sexual assault, violence, exploitation can change a person's life forever, and that's one single act. We know that these young people have experienced hundreds of acts of violence against them. They've been let down with people that have promised to care for them, and this is all before they've turned the age of 18. So the resources that are provided them have to be specialized, they have to be trauma-informed, they have to be survivor-informed, and they have to be comprehensive. And in order to be successful in that, we have to acknowledge that that's going to take money. It's going to take money, and it also is going to take an intense amount of time to get them back on their feet. So in closing, I just want to mention how grateful the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is to be here today, how wonderful it is to be a part of this conversation and this ongoing dialogue and connecting the dots between missing children, children who have run away, and those who are vulnerable to child sex trafficking. And we welcome a continued conversation in any way we can support your ongoing efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Also recognize that Senator Sabatina is joined us. Thank you, Senator, for being here as well. I just have a couple of questions. There's a perception in our state, I think, in our neighborhoods. I represent a suburban community, our communities, and they're shocked when they hear that maybe some form of human trafficking has occurred in their mall or in somewhere in our suburban community. Are we immune from this type of activity? Are our children immune from this type of activity? Can we fall and may have a false sense of security that our children are not at risk by these predators? Maybe make a comment about that.
Absolutely, thank you. I wish I could name a community that was immune for this, because then it would be a model community, then we could all figure out how to replicate that. Sadly, the motivation for traffickers is all about the money. And the greatest vulnerability for young people is their age, right? These are predators that have made their 24/7 business option about targeting and figuring out vulnerabilities in young people. And every teenager goes through a period of vulnerability that the traffickers are able to take advantage of. So this is an issue that is in every city, in every community, across the United States. So it's not saying that communities are not doing all that they need to do to protect young people. It's that we have to figure out different ways to address the issue and connect resources to further protect.
And how can we tell our citizens how to protect their children? Is it the malls that they're receptive or vulnerable? Is it the internet, or is it all those and other things? Can you give us some advice to parents on how they can protect their children from this?
Absolutely. Parents have a huge role to play in this, and it's tough to be a parent right now because every day there's a new social networking app that comes online that is providing a whole different opportunity for individual strangers to interact with your kids. And so parents have to be diligent. They have to be diligent for the computer that's in the home environment, the social networking applications that young people have on their phones and on their mobile devices. And they also have to be talking about kids on how to, in the real world, not just the online world, how to be aware that this crime exists. And so at the National Center, we do have some great resources that are really age appropriate, and the sooner you start these conversations, the better. We have some great age appropriate tools, games, online apps, and resources that can help parents figure out how to start that conversation with their kids, and also just kids that they're concerned about that are in their community.
So can a citizen of Pennsylvania contact your agency for assistance? Do you have that capability? And if so, how do they contact you?
Absolutely. So missingkids.org is the website. NetSmarts is the division. You can go online and check out that entire website that has those online resources and tools. And if you're a teacher or you're a member of the community that has a church youth group or things like that, we also will come out to communities and provide these resources, these types of presentations, so that people know how to access the resources.
Senator Leach?
Thank you for your very compelling testimony. And thank you for mentioning our bill, 851, which we're working on. So give us some thoughts on the bill. Specifically, one of the things we're struggling with is that, the bill, as you know, provides immunity from criminal charges. But if someone is caught up, that's determined for solicitation, whatever, it's determined they're under 18, they're not eligible for criminal prosecution, but we still want to get them to get services, but we don't want to threaten them with punishment criminally if they don't get services. We don't do that as we've heard from any other crime. So how do you think that is your experience that there's a lot of resistance to getting these services from the young people themselves? And can you give me sort of a typical trajectory of what happens after the fact once they've encountered law enforcement, and any advice you can give us on how to make those outcomes better would be appreciated as well.
How much time do you have? So I think this is a really important conversation because we have to be honest about the fact that these young people are going to be resistant. They are not going to self-identify. They're going to be resistant to assistance in most cases. But that doesn't mean that we can't set up services that better engage, that better build rapport and connect. I've been working with a variety of different communities on how even from that first moment of recovery, that interaction that they have with that law enforcement officer, these young people are incredibly observant, right? They're hypervigilant because of the trauma that they've been through, and so they're reading people. They're reading people constantly to figure out, are you safe? Can I trust you? Are you really going to help me? And I think if I can kind of quote a survivor that I've worked with for a really long time, she had been trafficked for 7 years. She had had 5 different pimps. She'd been arrested on numerous times in different states on prostitution charges and a variety of other masking charges. And when she came into contact with this one particular law enforcement officer, she said, I realized that he saw more in me than I saw in myself at the time. And this law enforcement officer is extremely dedicated. He gets the issue. And from that moment, that connection was able to give her the safety that she needed to be able to then engage with services and cooperate in the investigation and go on to successfully assist in the prosecution of her current trafficker as well as the original trafficker that had turned her out at the age of 13. So I think the short answer is this is a tough population because of the amount of trauma that they've been through, but the better we get at creating those specialized services, the more successful we are. It's our responsibility to change to fit what they need, not their responsibility after everything they've been through to become compliant with services that actually aren't fitting their needs. And I think that that's actually where we've missed the mark over time. You know, when I hear people say these kids are tough, they don't engage in services, they're not sticking around, my question is, what are you not doing to get them to stick around? I have seen programs that have adjusted just a couple things and have entirely changed their outcomes with these young people. So there's absolutely a way to do it, and there's a way that there are different models that I can certainly provide you with that are being more successful. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Hugh Organ, Covenant House, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for being here today and presenting testimony. Morning.
Is your microphone on?
I'm sorry, you have to press the button and the green light should be on, okay?
Green light is now on.
All right, great. All right, thank you.
The Covenant House is the largest nonprofit shelter provider for runaway homeless and trafficked youth in the Philadelphia region. Annually, we shelter over 500 kids from the city of Philadelphia and the surrounding areas. Each night we do street outreach, 5 nights a week, where we go out and we contact kids who are homeless, runaway, and trafficked who are on the streets of Philadelphia. Kids are being sold on street corners pretty much every night of the week. In the 16 years of working at Covenant House, I've encountered countless number of trafficked youth. With the domestic minors that I've worked with, pretty much to 100% of those kids were runaways at one point in time. And if they weren't reported as runaways, they should have been reported. And in several instances, you'll have kids who, for example, no one reported missing because either their family's not involved or their family is involved in the trafficking side of this. So in the 16 years of working with these kids, we've seen a mixed bag of all different types of trafficking with domestic minors. But the one thing to a T is they were all runaways and technically missing at some point in time, whether or not someone reported them that way, but they were all runaways or missing at one point in time. Every domestic minor that when we talk about runaways and missing kids, one of the things we have to break down is the stereotype of what a runaway looks like. We have to get rid of the idea of the Tom Sawyer who throws the satchel over his back and goes for a walk because he's pissed at mom. The reality is kids are running away from home for a reason. It's not safe for them to be at home. So you're talking about trauma that goes on in the home. They're leaving the home and then being targeted by human traffickers. Traffickers target your most vulnerable populations. Runaway, homeless, and trafficked youth are those populations of kids. They're going to target those kids, and they sell love. They're going to tell the kids, we'll provide you with shelter, we'll give you everything you need. And that's how they rope these kids in, because if you don't have a supportive, loving family to back you up, this person who comes along who promises you all this stuff, this sounds great, sign me up, I'm going to go. One of the things in working with these kids, and just to share a little bit, we work with a 16-year-old, And again, these kids come from all different walks of life, all different economics classes, you name it. This 16-year-old was actually from out of the state, was trafficked to Philadelphia, and had been missing for 3 months when we encountered this kid. And there was no missing report filed. There was no runaway report filed. Mom was involved. Mom knew where this kid was. She was with the trafficker in New York City. Why file a missing or runaway report? That's going to draw attention to what's going on with this young person. No missing persons report, no runaway report was ever filed for this kid, but for 3 months she was trafficked in New York City and then eventually brought to Philadelphia. And it was in Philadelphia she realized she had other family in the area and contacted the other family that was living in this area. And they immediately reported this kid as being missing. Law enforcement was able to get involved. We were able to get that young lady out of that situation and actually get her out of the state altogether into a safe location for domestic minors of trafficking. Part of the reason I bring this issue up is for a number of things, but particularly for the fact that a lot of these kids go unreported, and also for the fact that there is a lack of resources for these kids. That, to my knowledge, there is no place in the state of Pennsylvania that specifically works with domestic minors of sex trafficking. While we are a shelter and we do the very best that we can with these kids, we do not specifically work with this population. We have runaway, we have homeless youth that are staying with us as well, not just sex trafficking victims. So there is no location, to my knowledge, in the state of Pennsylvania that works specifically with domestic minors. So where are we going to have these kids go to, which is another issue of resources. The other young lady we worked with was 15 years old, and this young lady was reported as a runaway. Kid who grew up in the child welfare system. Again, easy mark for traffickers. Mom's in prison, dad is dead. This is a kid who's in the child welfare system. She meets a guy via Facebook. He invites her to Philadelphia. She's trafficked in Philadelphia, and because the police had been trained, the warrant unit actually was serving a warrant for this young lady's pimp and interacted with this young lady and realized something's not right here, and they called for services for this young lady, and we were able to get her out. But she had been reported, people had followed procedures. The group home that she had stayed with, they followed the runaway reporting procedures. They notified the police, and when the police stopped and questioned this young lady, it came up in the system that she was a runaway, and they were able to get her out of that situation. Now, if you've ever worked with human trafficking victims, especially with domestic minors of trafficking victims, again, one of the things you see is traffickers sell love, and these kids love their traffickers. And it may sound odd, but if you've ever worked with a teenager or had a teenager in your home that was in love, this 15-year-old was in love with her pimp. When you mentioned his name, she giggled. She doodled his name on different paperwork. She was in love with her pimp. So part of it is understanding that that's something else that we have to work with as social service providers, as law enforcement agencies. That's a whole other issue that we need to work with these young people around. And a part of it stems back to we have to work to empower these kids because everything has been stripped from them. They have been told what to do, where to go. Everything has been taken from them by this trafficker. And he is the center of their world. So we have to work to empower these kids. Simple things of understanding that their food, what kind of food would you like to eat? What do you want to be called? Because they have street names. Traffickers give them a name and they'll use that name on the street. What do you want to be called? Simple things like that just to start to build trust with these kids. Again, it starts very simply with food. With this 15-year-old, we spent hours talking to this kid and never once mentioned her pimp. We talked about what she wanted to do with her life, how she wanted to proceed going forward, what she wanted to do with school. Never once talking about her pimp, because the moment you talk about him and say, he's a bad guy, she's going to shut you out, and she's not going to talk to you more about what's going on in her situation. It's about empowering these kids. The other young lady I'd like to talk about quickly is a 16-year-old, and a young lady, again, not from our area, from a pretty good family, from down south, was brought to Philadelphia by a caretaker here in Philadelphia and ran away from that caretaker due to an altercation that occurred. And she encountered a man in Philadelphia who then took her to a house in northeast Philadelphia. She was held there, she was trafficked there, going on several weeks, and it was only after she was able to contact another family member in the area who then called police that they were able to get that young lady out of that situation. Again, missing for an extended period of time. No one filed a missing persons report on this young lady. But we were able to get her out of that situation, work with police to get her all the treatment and care that she provided, or she needed. So one of the things for me is this is a huge training issue. When I train all across the state of Pennsylvania, one of the big red flag indicators when you're talking about domestic minor sex trafficking victims, do they have a history of running away? Do they stay away from home for 30 days or longer? Because if you think about it, what minor do you know can live on their own for 30 days at a time without the support of an adult? Red flag for human trafficking. What minor do you know can travel to another city, a state, without the assistance of an adult? Again, red flags for possible human trafficking. So we train on this across the state when we do this, and a part of it is understanding that that is a serious red flag when you're talking about domestic minor trafficking, because the average age of entry in the United States into prostitution is 13 years of age. So we're talking about all these kids who are at such great risk of being trafficked, these runaway kids. And again, if they're traveling to other areas while they're on that runaway, that's a red flag for human trafficking. So we train people on this at all times. And even some of the statistics match up with, like, for example, in the FBI, they report that the kids that they've encountered in Philadelphia and got out of the system, 75% were chronic runaways. Chronic runaways. That's 3 or more times. Again, red flags for human trafficking. In New York and New Orleans, we did a study of the kids who came into our shelter, and 20% of the kids who entered our shelter who were involved in the survey reported being involved in commercial sex trafficking. This is a huge problem, and this is not just a big city problem. This goes on all across the state of Pennsylvania. The young lady that I spoke about, the last young lady who was trafficked in Northeast Philadelphia, she was being advertised on Backpage.com. Huge problem, huge problem. There are kids being advertised on Backpage.com every day. You can see the ads yourself. They're there every single day. These kids are being sold all across the state of Pennsylvania. Right there. They're right there on Backpage. Those things need to be addressed if we're really going to make a dent into sex trafficking, especially child sex trafficking. And a part of it for me is understanding that we need the resources, we need the law, and statistics are hard to come by. The nice thing about Act 105 that was passed recently was that now that information is confidential. Before, you couldn't track the information because it would be subject to being brought into court and used against the kid. So the nice thing about Act 105 is now we can collect as much information about trafficking victims, and it's confidential information. It's not subject to a subpoena and to be brought into court. So those tools, that tool there is going to be very helpful in working with the kids we do work with at Covenant House. Some of the other things that we need to do, safe harbor. We need protection for these kids so they're not arrested. We need diversionary programs for these kids because locking them up is not going to solve the problem. And a part of it for me is how can we build trust with these kids that we're getting out of these situations by locking them up. We first have to begin by meeting these kids' needs, basic needs. You know, love and care is how we got to provide services for these kids, and that's where it starts. Then we build trust with these kids, and then they're able to talk about what took place, get the treatments and services they may need. So there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed when it comes to child sex trafficking across the state of Pennsylvania, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it here today.
Thank you. Do you have any idea how many, you're located in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, and how many children are there, do you think, in Pennsylvania that originate in Pennsylvania and are being trafficked? I know there's no specific amount. I mean, it's impossible to answer that question, but maybe give us a general idea. I mean, you're involved in it on a regular basis. How prevalent is this problem?
Again, we estimate that 10% of the kids we shelter every year are victims of sex trafficking. So that's about 50 kids. And I think that's the tip of the iceberg. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And the more training we do, the more I think we're going to identify this problem because, again, we've just reached the tip of the iceberg when it comes to sex trafficking in the state of Pennsylvania.
You mentioned some issues in regard to how these children are cared for. There are I mean, there's parents, there's guardians, there's single moms, how are we doing in Pennsylvania in regard to protecting our children when they're in the quote, protection of the state? Or are there, and who are the groups that they've betrayed these children?
Yeah, as far as in the custody of the state, we're currently working on that. There's a work group right now in response to House Resolution 4980, which I'll be going to shortly, to address the fact that, the kids in care and reporting. And I think we do a pretty sufficient job with reporting kids as being runaway or missing. We need to get better at it, of course. But I think the child welfare system does a good job. The areas for me that we need to improve upon greatly in the state of Pennsylvania is the screening of these kids. To my knowledge, we're not screening them coming into the child welfare system. The screening of a kid when he runs away. There should be a screening when a kid comes back to find out what happened while you were on a runaway. Those things need to be in place, and with the passage of this new law, I think that will come into place in the state of Pennsylvania.
And just follow up on your comment about the back page internet. I don't even know what that is, but maybe you can explain a little bit about that, and how can we, you said you need help in regard to that particular area. How can we help you?
Yeah, Backpage.com is basically an internet website. It's an open market website, and on there you can purchase people, escorts, you name it. And there are ads every day. We did a count on a Thursday night just in the Philadelphia area, just in ads that we saw as possible red flags for human trafficking, and we counted 224 on a Thursday night. So there are ads, and those go all across Pennsylvania. Allentown has a place, Reading. These ads run all across PA, and this is a nationwide problem. My thing is the new street corner is the internet. You don't have to have a kid out on the street corner. You can look online and have a kid even brought to you to some extent.
Okay. Senator Sabatino.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. Thank you for your testimony. I just wanted to say I'm a newly elected senator from Philadelphia, so I'm wondering just where exactly is the highest concentration of people, I guess the children, you said you do an outreach in Philadelphia, I assume. What neighborhoods, what areas are you getting your children from?
We do outreach all over the city, and depending on which part of the city you're talking about, it looks very different. Like, for example, we do a lot of street outreach on Kensington Avenue. We do a lot of outreach in Germantown, Southwest Philadelphia, West Philadelphia. It looks very different. Like, if you want to see kids on the street, Kensington Avenue and 13th Street. You'll see young ladies on Kensington Avenue, and you'll see young men on 13th Street. In the different parts of the city, it's out of hotel rooms, depending on what part of the city you're in, especially by the airport. There's a lot going on at the hotels at the airport and some of the hotels along the boulevard as well. So it looks very different depending on which part of the city you're in, but we do outreach all over, and we have different outreach tactics depending on which part of the city we're in.
Okay. And again, if there's ways I can help you personally in your efforts, please let me know.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to give a quick shout out to the next presenter, Judge Lori Dumas. Hello, Your Honor. How are you? All right. Unfortunately, I have to leave for another meeting, but thank you very much for your testimony, and thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, for being here. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Okay, our next witness is the Honorable Lori Dumas, 1st Judicial District. Judge. Thank you for being here, and just make sure that the green light's on your microphone. And
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I believe that it's on. Good morning, Chairman
morning.
Greenleaf and Leach and other members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you today to speak briefly about an epidemic that is stealing our children away from us before our very eyes. Thank you for affording me these few moments to share with you my experience with cases involving children who are victims of human trafficking. I was invited here today to speak about the connection between missing children and human trafficking. I must admit that while I was preparing my remarks for today, it took some intentional effort to stay in my lane and not encroach upon the assigned task of the other guests that will and have presented testimony today. Nevertheless, I need to tell you that in spite of the boundaries of my testimony today, the fullness of the ills of human trafficking of children has become a part of my everyday existence, and no amount of testimony from me could ever truly capture the destruction of these sinful, horrific acts against our children. My passion for children did not begin with human trafficking. I have been presiding over juvenile cases since my appointment to the bench in 2002. My assignment remained the same after being elected in 2003. It is indeed a privilege to be serving our children and fueling a passion at the same time, a passion driven by my own experiences. I am the product of a broken household, born and raised in Philadelphia to an alcoholic father and an undereducated mother who experienced sexual trauma at a very young age, thus causing her hardcore parenting to be laced with episodes of untreated trauma and severe overprotection. I'm the youngest of 3 children. 2 of us are college graduates with professional careers, and the other an entrepreneur. My siblings and I, regardless of what we look like on the outside, are all victims of our circumstances, of a broken home and a single mother who tried her very best to create a life for her children that was much different from her own. And although she somehow, in spite of her own brokenness, worked hard to support her children, was a fierce proponent of education, and even went back to school later in life to earn her college degree, unbeknownst to her, she was leaving behind traces of her own trauma, which even now, after her death, has colored the lives of her children forever. Although I was not able to identify why I fiercely advocated for children for many, many years, I now know that it was due to my own needs to ensure that all children receive the best opportunity to be raised in healthy environments. I learned about human trafficking both internationally and domestically through the experiences shared by my pastor's wife, Dr. Ellen Jo Waller, who has done extensive work in the anti-human trafficking movement, both here and abroad. After becoming aware that human trafficking of children actually exists in the city of Philadelphia, I couldn't help but wonder whether there were children in our court system who had been identified as victims, and if so, what were we doing to help them? I discussed my curiosity with the administrative judge at family court at that time, and he granted me the authority to begin to research the issue within our court. The revelation that we were actively serving identified child victims of human trafficking came within hours of my first inquiry. It was as if they were waiting to be discovered. Of course, those children who had been arrested and prosecuted for prostitution were the easiest to identify. But after further searching, the faces of these child victims began to peek out from behind the walls of what we now call justice. 2, then 3, 6, 8. The numbers over the months increased. With the blessing and support of the court's leadership, a pilot diversion court program was created to address not only the needs of these young victims, but also the risk factors that help to feed the vulnerability attractive to the predators that had stolen away the innocence of these babies. The program, called WRAP, Working to Restore Adolescents' Power, is a collaborative of dedicated professionals who have committed themselves, to helping these children move from victims to survivors. In order to truly impact these children, we had to first learn who they were and from where they had come. Who are the children of WRAP? It was no surprise that not one of these victims was the product of an intact family. As a matter of fact, over 90% of the youth that we have or are currently serving through this program either have or had at one time an open dependent petition through the Department of Human Services. Additionally, every young victim that we have experienced through the program has been identified as a runaway from either home or a DHS placement, such as foster care or group home, at some point during periods of their victimization. As a matter of fact, one of the main risk factors for this type of victimization is consistent runaway status. Traffickers cannot gain control over their victims if they are at home. They have to be isolated from their norms and support systems, no matter how dysfunctional, so the traffickers can brainwash these innocent babies and make them believe that only the traffickers can provide them with the love, nurturing, and care that they need. Thus, it's this manipulation that captures the hearts of children, and in the blink of an eye, subjects them to the most severest forms of violence and torture that one could ever imagine. There are several reports and studies that have identified with the fact that the largest group of at-risk children are runaway, thrown away, or homeless American children who use survival sex to acquire food, shelter, clothing, and other things needed to survive on America's streets. And according to the National Runaway Switchboard, 1.3 million runaway and homeless youth live on America's streets every day. How else is this young population to survive while on the streets? Of the 33 children that are or have been a part of our efforts in Philadelphia to combat human trafficking, only 9 of them receive services exclusively on the delinquent side of the court. However, these same youth either had a dependency petition open earlier in their lives, and for those that did not, there were significant dependency issues that existed to justify that a dependency petition be opened. All of these children were runaways at some point. All of these runaways were brought into our program through an arrest or through other anti-human trafficking efforts involving law enforcement. The children of RAP are between the ages of 13 and 21, mostly females. Their history of abuse is very common, some of which dates back to their pre-kindergarten years. Some of them had truancy issues very early on, and most of them had been removed from their homes due to incorrigibility, lack of supervision, or the lack of a suitable caretaker due to mental illness or drug addiction. Most of these children had been missing for many months before they were located due to no effort of their own. A few had been trafficked to jurisdictions outside of Pennsylvania and were gone for even longer periods of time. Although most of them look older than their years, they are only babies crying out for the love and protection that every child born into this world is entitled to. Their cries have been met with manipulation, violence, and torture. Every bit of self-esteem has been stripped away from them. For most of them, no one looked for them. Most of them had nowhere and nothing to return to, so they made the streets and the accompanying lifestyle their norm. Through RAP, we are attempting to change the story of each and every cry. Working with children who have become entrapped in the world of child trafficking is like putting together a broken porcelain doll. The role of the team surrounding each victim child is to find as many pieces of the doll as possible, delicately lay them out, to sort them, and to place each piece in its rightful place, to be glued back together, all while not furthering the brokenness even more, or causing self-injury due to the sharp and splintered edges of the broken pieces. This requires steady hands and intricate skills in the area of rebuilding, coupled with sincere empathy, patience, and the purest of hearts. Victims of child trafficking face significant problems. Physically, sexually, and mentally abused, they have distinctive medical and psychological needs that must be addressed before advancing in the formative years of adulthood. Often the children talk about all they have gone through, which is truly so much at their tender ages. However, we are challenged to help them maintain a belief in resiliency and restoration against some challenging odds. Child trafficking knows no limitations, so we must combat it with the same resolve. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you today, and I pray that something I've said will motivate further discussion and action to protect our children by keeping them in safe, healthy homes, and if they become runaways or listed as missing persons, that our efforts to find them will significantly increase and their lives become our priority. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your, your testimony and your efforts in regard to these children, and certainly your personal experience adds another authenticity to what you've said, not just as someone who reviews these cases, but someone who can relate and have compassion for them. Appreciate that. Let me ask you, you're probably the best witness for me to ask this question. Right now, we do have a bill, it's called the Safe Harbor Bill, that's pending before this committee. We've been discussing with the different interest groups that will be affected by this. And one of the things that's holding up the bill is a discussion of okay, now we've identified the problem. We've now trained the law enforcement officers to identify and to know and how to treat these victims as victims and not as criminals. It's about time we stop treating the victim as the criminal and the criminal as the victim. We have to stop that. And the issue has been is that when we have these children in our control and we identify them, obviously everybody agrees we need to treat them and to help them to understand what happened to them, and they're victims, and they have to, and there's some discussion that we should require them to be either prosecuted or come under some criminal jurisdiction, so the judge has and the authorities have ability to treat them. I don't like that idea at all, but there's some that are proposing that. So how do we ensure that they don't run away to their pimp and leave before we can care for them and put them back in the right direction?
Unfortunately, Senator, whether these young people are arrested and being serviced on the delinquent side or not arrested and being serviced on the dependent side, we can never ensure that they're not going to go back. The trauma is layered, meaning there are layers of trauma built on top of each other, more than any of us, even in my own situation, could ever imagine. Services, whoever is going to provide those services has to be trained significantly in the area of traffic trauma so that they can understand how to begin to unpack or unlayer the trauma. These children are never going to be 100% whole because of the trauma, although they can be successful in life. As I said in my own experience, trauma never leaves you. And so you can't expect these young people who already are at a disadvantage because they're young, they're babies, their developmental stages have been interrupted by the trauma itself, and you can't expect them to make decisions that make sense to us as adults and those of us who don't or have not experienced that type of trauma. No matter what we do or what efforts we try to put in place to help these victims, there is no crystal ball for what is going to work and what isn't. What we have seen is, and I believe that we've done a very good job in Philadelphia of trying to help these young people to understand we do love them. It's not a traditional program where you expect a judge and lawyers and social workers to sit around and cry through the whole hearing and trying to reach out to these young people and to touch them in a way that they truly understand we're here for them and our intentions are pure, because that's what they're not used to. But no matter how many times we do that, there is still the pull of the life that they came out of, that pimp or pimp-like person in their lives that they have grown accustomed to trusting. And it's going to take a lot of undoing. These kids are brainwashed. A lot of undoing to really be able to get through to them. to help them to be able to see and make the choice for themselves that they want to do better and they want to totally come out of the life. We have used, in our court program, we have children on both sides, delinquent, crossover, dependent. You know, do I have a better chance of making a child who has an open delinquent petition sit and go through the treatment? Yes, because I have the teeth, if you will, of that delinquent petition. Whereas on the dependent side, we day to day just hope and pray that they stay in the environments that they're in, which are specialized group homes at this point, because that's all that we have. And we have right now probably at least 6 young people in the program that are on AWOL status. It's hurtful because I know that everyone that sits around our table believes in what we do and believes in the success of these young people. But they have to believe it in order for them to really begin to move forward. So there has to be a happy medium somewhere with regard to Safe Harbor in wanting the very best for these children, having the very best services for these children, and still keeping them safe. And that's really where the brush is. But we can figure it out. I think that there are enough people that care about this issue to be able to get around a table and figure it out.
What if there was the presumption is that they not be in custody, but that the child welfare agencies or some designated agency that would be interested in helping these children could petition the court, not in a criminal proceeding, but in a civil proceeding, and then you as a judge could decide whether at that time whether you should exercise some kind of additional control over them for their benefit. I'm very ouchy about treating them, that continue to treat them as criminals.
Yes.
I feel very uncomfortable about that, and about giving anybody someone that'll do more damage to the child.
Absolutely.
And maybe a judge can make that decision, knowing that our purpose here is that they're victims and we're trying to help them. But sometimes when we're trying to do that, we can do more harm. So
Absolutely.
I don't really know the answer to that. I think what I prefer, but I appreciate your opinion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. And in fact, I might ask the previous witnesses that question, and see if you could give some input about it at the end of our last, if you could wait. And yes, and our next witness is Frank Cervone, Support Center for Child Advocates. Thank you for being here today, and I'd like to hear what you have to say.
It's great to see you, and be glad to take up that issue. It is one of the core issues in our work. We're all engaging this question. So good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation, and especially thank you for the leadership on this topic. You've been the stalwart star in a field that has not had many leaders, and we appreciate it. The Support Center for Child Advocates is, as you know, is Philadelphia's lawyer pro bono program for abused and neglected children. At Child Advocates, we work to change the story for children. For 38 years, we've offered the skills and dedication of lawyer, social worker teams, and this year will represent a record high number of children, more than 1,025 young people aged birth to 21, including several in Judge Dumas's rap court. While our direct service work is Philadelphia-focused, we work with partners across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the nation on the development of effective policy and practice for vulnerable children. We attempt to offer a balanced and candid and constructive assessment of what our children need and how we're all doing for our kids. We focus today on issues related to the population of children and youth who are or may be trafficked for sex or for work. During my testimony, I'll explore this phenomenon of sex and labor trafficking, the population of children who are targeted and victimized, and their range of backgrounds and needs, explore the gaps in our ability to identify and to engage them, examine a little bit about how our Pennsylvania story really mirrors the national picture. This is not an area in which we are tremendously ahead or behind, though we have some optimistic things happening here. And then to suggest some solutions. I've prepared extensive remarks, and I won't read all of those and talk about all of those. So you obviously have those along with the academic literature which we've offered for your benefit. Just wanted to highlight some items from the prepared remarks. We have learned that Philadelphia and Pennsylvania experiences mirror the national picture in numerous key ways. There's a lack of knowledge by community members and law enforcement on how to identify and how to respond to trafficking cases. And victims of trafficking, of course, don't self-identify, so we're left wondering. And it often is weeks into an engagement with a youth by either the child welfare or juvenile justice or even the school systems before the particular background that we've been talking about is revealed. There's no centralized venue to convey information on responding to the crimes of human trafficking of children or of adults to law enforcement. The calls go into the 911 system and, in point of fact, kind of get lost there because there is no mechanism for flagging these cases per se. We're very, very early in the development of essentially the labels seen in a constructive sense so as to keep track of these cases. There's no defined locus of responsibility within local government to respond to reports of suspected trafficking or to coordinate a response. The Philadelphia Police Department, obviously by far the largest in Philadelphia, for years has kind of split the responsibility between Vice, right, the adult side, and the Special Victims Unit, the child abuse side. Only in the last year and a half have they made really significant efforts to kind of fix their own bureaucratic approach, and I say that in a positive sense, right? Not to mention there's no identified resource, let alone dollars to support the work, to do the investigative outreach such as Mr. Organ described, right? We know where much of this is happening, and there's no cop out there to do it, let alone no whole force of officers, of investigators for really what's needed, the real advanced work that's going to need to happen. Local law enforcement and federal investigators working on these matters have not officially established in most jurisdictions the kind of what are known as deconfliction protocols. Who's handling the case, right? Is it a federal case, a state case, a local case? Who's leading? And so you've got lots of gaps, not so much conflict, because there is really a lot of cooperation, particularly between the feds and in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Police Department. There's a fairly high degree of communication and collaboration. There's a lot of respect between these separate law enforcement groups. But there need to be pathways. There's no data sharing protocol related to information. So you're doing it on a catch-as-catch-can basis, case-by-case basis. And certainly at the institutional level, the school districts don't have the ability to release information in any very clear pathway. And so you run up against the kind of classic confidentiality roadblocks, times 20. We've heard over and over again, both young and adult victims of trafficking avoid and resist identification, right? Well, they don't want to get out of the life. Well, they want to be here. They don't want to be found. Well, these are just parts of the business. They have to be part of in a sense, the starting point for us rather than the end point. Many professionals are ambivalent to probe deeply into essentially the personal needs of these client victims. We've heard this stuff, these activities, the work, the life, comes out of a deep experience of trauma history, of multiple poverties, of money and of spirit and of family life. And folks struggle with whether to go deep there and how. So we need to learn how to do this work. I really want to flag a couple of things that haven't been talked about today, just to, in a sense, add to the base of knowledge. Again, my prepared remarks are more expansive. Mr. Organ mentioned the H.R. 4980 implementation work group. This is federal legislation which has occasioned action by state officials. And I think very optimistically and constructively, the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services has convened an implementation work group with lots of us and lots of others engaged in it. And the dialogue is real constructive and ongoing. So we're doing some real good work. Labor trafficking. Although most cases of child trafficking are identified as sex trafficking, cases of child labor trafficking have been identified in agricultural work, restaurants, peddling, and begging rings. In particular, runaway and homeless youth programs have identified young adults and teenagers who were recruited into traveling sales crews with the promise of travel and friends and money, only to be subsequently coerced into selling goods and, of course, selling themselves. We see this overlap of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. People talk a lot about sex trafficking, but the labor issues are, in a sense, just as profound and deep. We expect to see foreign nationals among both populations of sex and labor trafficked children, and perhaps these also connect to immigration issues. Yet another complicating picture. Most research focuses on commercial sexual exploitation of children, CSEC, right? But there's a paucity of literature on child labor trafficking. We should not underestimate the yet another population needing that kind of attention. And then I just, lastly, before addressing some solutions, want to highlight the lack of data. I'm looking at page 7 of my own prepared remarks. Our own office represents thousands of abused and neglected children. We keep track of hundreds of data elements on each child and our service to them. We have a fairly advanced, I say in all modesty, a fairly advanced data collection system and outcome measurement system, and we don't track child trafficking. Right? We could, we're going to get to it once we figure out what the fields of data should be and how they should be named, but no one's counting them. Right? So the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania child welfare systems, their data sets aren't tracking this stuff. The Philadelphia police and state police only beginning to track these cases. And so you ask how many there are. It's not just because we can't find them. The ones we find, we don't name. We don't count. Right? And that's just the beginning. It's really the tip of the iceberg. We're not going to get anywhere unless we can answer your question, how many there are, and we're not going to do that if we don't start to count them. To the best of our knowledge, there's no data fields of any note that are specific to child trafficking in most, if not all, child welfare, juvenile justice, or juvenile court systems. In January 13, the federal UCR, the Uniform Crime Reporting mechanism, began collecting data on human trafficking. This was a very big deal. When UCR caught up to human trafficking, in a sense, on the adult side, the criminal justice world now has a rubric for it. UCR is the federal crimes coding device. So when people say, well, crime is up, rape is up, murder is up, they're talking about UCR tracking. The UCR now has fields related to human trafficking, but it's never had child-specific fields. And so, in a sense, law enforcement doesn't have that tool. And lastly, I just want to turn to boys. It's likely we know more about sex trafficking of girls than about sex trafficking of boys, due both to the current public awareness and the types of situations identified by law enforcement and service providers. One survey identified contributing factors leading to the under-identification of boys victimized in sex trafficking, including, of course, what we know to be a kind of traditional unwillingness of boys to self-identify as sexually exploited due to their own shame and stigma, the lack of screening and intake by first responders, and limited outreach by organizations to areas and venues where boys are more likely to be commercially sexually exploited. Likewise, in a sense, we should address the populations of sexual minorities, another area of a sense demographic where more attention should be paid, where we really think there's in a sense under-identification from a population that's already dramatically under-identified. I'm just going to turn to some solutions beginning on page 9 of my materials. We We need a coordinated, institutionalized collaboration among the various public and private entities that are engaged in this work. So Judge Dumas is a tremendous and visionary leader in our own community, and she created, just because of her own force of will, the steering committee to advise the court and the Philadelphia Department of Human Services around the court, but really around this population. We need to have those sorts of dialogues all over the Commonwealth, in all sorts of venues, because so much of this work is going to be local. Child welfare, child engagement, family engagement are local phenomenon. How it happens in Harrisburg and in York and Erie, let alone in Susquehanna and in Cambria and elsewhere, we know they're different. Screening and assessment devices are lacking and are seen in every piece of literature as a key feature. We need to identify victims of trafficking to gain a full picture of their experiences, to understand their service needs, and to monitor their own progress towards recovery and improved well-being over time. It's still entirely colloquial. It's case by case. It's, oh, I think I had one of those cases, and so on. There are specific indicators and tools that have been developed, but there aren't many. This is an area of clinical practice that is very young and needs to advance. At or near intake, screening and assessment can engage and identify some of these issues. And of course, one of those significant issues is the incidence of trauma. And we know that trauma is everywhere in our work. It's thankfully everywhere, just about everywhere in our understanding and dialogues these days. But we're really just beginning to get there in developing the workforce capacity to engage trauma, to engage the traumatized victim by way of clinical work. And so much of our work continues to traumatize the traumatized person. Right? This is really the genius behind your bill and moving from a criminalization to a victimization kind of model about this work. Right? The criminal justice system handcuffing the young person just accentuates the trauma. Right? Now, we all know what handcuffs do. They secure and they keep everybody safe, but they do all of these negative stigmas. Right? And so just a few years ago, the courts did away with shackling of kids in the courtroom for exactly that reason. Right? We're seeing this sort of approach really across our work. You heard about the incidence and prevalence really of the runaway youth and the runaway profile in this population of trafficked kids. Kids run away because of problems at home. Problems at home happen because the family is not functioning well. The incidence of, in a sense, family dysfunction is huge in our communities. It's at the core of so many other issues. Now, this obviously isn't to vilify families. Quite the contrary, it's to say that families need help. And that families in particular need help in how to handle and engage their teenagers. We all know how difficult it is to raise a teenager, let alone how to be a teenager. Right? Families need help. That's going to be a source, and that's going to be a key for our work. We need family therapy. It's really hard to find family therapy in Pennsylvania these days. It's just plain old really hard to find it, let alone to find one that will engage the kinds of needy families that we have so many of. We explored in some detail the issues around data, so I'm going to skip those and just flag two items that might be of particular note to you on the top of page 11. We have in our system on the court side the Common Pleas Case Management System. This is the statewide, fairly massive, ever-expanding case management database that AOPC, the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, created and runs to run the court system. It's chock full of data and information and really can be grown to manage and essentially handle some of these items of data, such as the judges and folks in the courts are engaging. So, but we need to invite AOPC, which is tremendously really overtaxed in growing that system. I've been very involved with them, so I don't mean to say they're not doing enough, but they could use the support and help to grow. And then over here on the child welfare side, we're about to see the new Child Welfare Information System, CWIS. CWIS is being designed and implemented by the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and needs child sex and labor trafficking fields of information, right? And the legislature can really help that happen, both with resources and the kind of encouragement that only you can give. Lastly, I want to talk about Senate Bill 851, which we love. We commend you. It's a great piece of legislation. But what I think is at the core, you said, you put your finger earlier in your questions on this key question of prosecution versus treatment, right? We've already explored how, in a sense, prosecution and criminalization extend the victimization. We know that there are certain individuals, adults and young people, who need some level of the hammer, right, rather than the velvet glove, right? But you shouldn't be getting to the hammer till you've worked the velvet glove. And you shouldn't be using the velvet glove till you've really engaged this child, right, hands-on, right, person to person, eye to eye, the way therapists and clinicians do, right? It's an attitudinal change. It's not just a confinement change. The whole notion that confinement and restriction are going to make the difference is really just illusory. We're not sending these kids to YDCs and locking them up. When they're on the criminal justice side, the juvenile justice side, they're going to many of the same institutions that we would send them as dependent kids. But they're going with a different attitude. They're going with different labels. They're certainly going with a different record that will carry on into their future. It's a difference of attitude. And we hear this in the little syllogism that the folks in trauma work so much now. They say, we used to ask, what did you do? Now we ask, what happened to you? That's going to be the change. That when we encourage the use of the dependent side and non-criminal, non-punitive measures, we get at what happened to that child. Because this stuff is coming from something in their history. It's not coming from the air. It's coming from a lack of something. A lack of love, like Mr. Organ said, a lack of self-esteem, like the judge said, and so many other places. So lastly, we should remember that the dependent court has the very same authority over a youth as does the delinquent court. They come from the same body of law, the Juvenile Act. They can't discharge a case until there's a positive outcome, until the court is satisfied that there is an outcome that it's satisfied with. The kid that's going to be AWOL on the delinquent side is going to be AWOL on the dependent side. And when they find them, they bring them back, and they come before the court again. We're using in Pennsylvania crossover jurisdiction of delinquent and dependent, lots more these days. That's the way, that's a very reasonable path. We don't need to charge a young person with prostitution. The very use of the term prostitution suggests an actor who has full capacity and full intention, who's made a decision to be in this business. And can we really say that about the 15-year-old who ran away and then got involved in this for all the reasons that we know? So thanks very much again for your leadership. We appreciate the opportunity to be here and to help you move this forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and your very thorough presentation and your service. Your comments on the on how do we care for these children, I guess is the term I would use for them, and to put them and make them whole. And I guess there's no real definite answers to it. We just have to, each child is different. Each child is going to have to be treated differently, and we have to just give all the tools we can to those people that come in contact with them.
It's always been my measure of work with kids that our task isn't just to care for them in the moment. It's to grow them into healthy adults. Right. It's a visionary mission, right? It's a visionary engagement. So what's going to get them into healthy adults? Putting them in a jail cell, putting them in handcuffs,
right.
Putting a label on them as a criminal, right?
Right.
It is to get to wholeness.
Give them a criminal record. Traumatizing them again is not going to help them to be repaired, to be helped. And so thank you for your comments. They're very, very helpful.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I don't know, Ms. Snow, would you be interested in making any comments about how we overcome this issue about how we treat children after they've been identified. And I don't know if you want to make those comments or not, or we're welcome to have you say something about it. Okay. Give it a shot.
One of your favorite topics, right?
Yes, I know. Well, I will keep it brief, but I think that when we're talking especially about that continuum of care, we really need to think about being innovative in how we both look at what exists within the system and how we can retool it to fit this population, and also how we need to create something that may be a little different. And so I'm just going to highlight what some other states I'm kind of hearing that they're working towards in kind of creating that continuum of care. And one of the first steps that I'm seeing in areas that have done safe harbor legislation over the past couple years, where they've kind of gotten caught up on a stumbling block, is they've automatically gone towards creating a long-term, specialized, beautiful paint-on-the-wall Zen garden placement for these young people. And while in the continuum of care, this is absolutely what they deserve and need, that trauma-informed, specialized environment, taking a kid out of a hotel room and then putting them in a environment like that is too drastic of a shift. There needs to be an in-between step for an emergency response, crisis response that has all the things that all of us have been talking about, that's specialized, therapeutic, trauma-informed, but allows a space where young people can be assessed. There can be a period of stabilization. They can be assessed so that we can better determine where that next step should be. Maybe it's therapeutic foster care. Maybe it's a long-term specialized placement. Maybe it's a substance abuse treatment, but we can't make that decision at 2 a.m. in the morning when they're in the middle of chaos. We need a space where that emergency step can take place. And so I've seen a couple areas working towards this, like for example, really looking at the licensing regulations for child placement and what already exists. Like for example, Maryland is looking at their diagnostic centers. This is a short-term, up to 90 days diagnostic center where there's a variety of assessments that can take place. It has a heightened level of protection in place, so it's not like a group home or foster placement where they can kind of immediately walk out the front door. They're unsupervised. There's a higher staff-to-client ratio. And they're looking at how they can retool that to specialize it for this population, which I think is very innovative for that piece. I also think that we have to look at what we need to change for the current regulations to say that the child welfare, we have to shift to the child protection response, but to say that the child welfare placements that currently exist are the solution is really short-sighted, because we know that this is what's creating a vulnerability and what kids are already running away from. Right? And so how do we look at the regs and how do we actually change that to make a placement that is going to be a good option? And one example of this, in Washington State, they had Becca's Law. And this was in response to high-risk, frequent runners being able to intervene. And the law failed for a variety of, the law passed, but the implementation failed for a variety of reasons, and a lot of it had to do with the lack of resources. But this was the creation in Becca's Law of a separate and individual placement called a secure crisis residential facility. And the components of the law were all there for that kind of therapeutic, specialized approach, but the funding didn't follow. And so I think those are the two pieces that we also have to talk about simultaneously, is how do we craft this response in that continuum of identification, assessment, emergency placement, and then a variety of different options for young people that can create that individualized plan. But also, how are we properly going to resource that so that we are able to give them what they deserve and what they need?
Sorry, that this is treatment, not punishment, that they're not there as a criminal offender, but as a victim that needs treatment. If we set that policy and that goal, then hopefully those people who are responsible for this would follow through on it. But it's a work in progress. But thank you so much for being here and for educating us and helping us, and we look forward to using you as a resource, if you don't mind, in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.